1,200 versus 10,000. On a cold morning in 1600 Japan, a handful of exhausted samurai stood knee-deep in mud, staring into a wall of fog that swallowed sound, direction, and hope. War drums echoed somewhere unseen. Banners vanished into white nothingness. Orders dissolved into confusion. This was supposed to be a straightforward clash, but history twisted it into something far darker. Japan, at the dawn of the 17th century, was a nation holding its breath. For decades, the islands had burned with civil war clans rising, falling, betraying one another in an endless struggle for dominance. Then came Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the unifier, the man who forced peace through sheer will. But now he was dead, and with his death, the fragile balance shattered. His heir was only a child. Into that vacuum stepped powerful warlords, each claiming loyalty to the Toyotomi name while quietly sharpening blades for the throne. Among them stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient, calculating, a man who understood that time itself could be a weapon. Opposing him was Ishida Mitsunari, brilliant but rigid, a loyalist clinging to a fading order, surrounded by allies whose devotion was uncertain at best. By autumn of 1600, Japan had split in two. Armies marched from every province, banners snapping in the wind, armor creaking with every step. They converged not on a grand capital, but on a narrow, unremarkable valley called Sekigahara, a place of crossroads, mountains, and mud. It was never meant to host the battle that would decide Japan's future. That is what made it so dangerous. Tens of thousands of samurai poured into the valley under heavy skies. Campfires flickered through the night as commanders studied maps by torchlight, aware that a single mistake here would not mean defeat, it would mean annihilation. Every clan carried its own ambitions, its own secret negotiations, its own doubts, and as dawn approached, something else arrived. A thick, unnatural fog began to roll down from the surrounding hills, swallowing landmarks, muting sound, blinding scouts. Men could hear armies moving but could not see them. Allies felt suddenly distant. Enemies felt everywhere. Sekigahara was no longer just a battlefield. It was a test of loyalty, nerve, and vision, where numbers would matter less than timing, and where survival would depend on decisions made before a single sword was drawn. As the fog closed in, one truth became clear. By the end of this day, Japan would belong to only one man. Before the first blade struck flesh, the Battle of Sekigahara was already tearing men apart from the inside. As dawn broke, commanders stared into a fog so thick it swallowed distance and distorted sound. Orders that should have taken seconds now took minutes if they arrived at all. Messengers vanished into the white haze, their footsteps fading, their loyalty untested in the silence. No one could see the full battlefield. No one could be certain who stood where. For Ishida Mitsunari, the weight was crushing. He knew the numbers favored him on paper, but wars were not fought on paper. From his position, he could only guess whether key allies on the surrounding hills would descend to support him, or wait, or worse, turn. Every heartbeat without movement felt like a judgment. His authority depended on obedience, yet hesitation gnawed at the edges of his command. Across the valley, Tokugawa Ieyasu felt a different kind of pressure. Calm on the surface, his mind raced beneath the armor. He knew he was outnumbered. One wrong move, one premature attack, and his army would be swallowed whole. But the fog offered something rare, uncertainty. And uncertainty could be shaped. Among the rank and file, fear crept quietly. Samurai tightened their grips on damp spear shafts, listening to sounds that might be enemies or echoes. Horses snorted nervously. Arquebusiers cursed as moisture threatened their powder. Men whispered rumors born from anxiety. So-and-so has defected. The hill clans are watching us. We are already surrounded. The fog turned imagination into a weapon. Every soldier fought not just the enemy, but his own thoughts, visions of betrayal, of being abandoned, of dying unseen and unremembered in the mud. Trust, the foundation of any army, began to fracture under the strain. And somewhere above the valley, on the mist-covered ridges, commanders waited silent, unmoving, measuring which side looked strongest and which looked doomed. In that stillness, with nerves stretched to breaking point, the battle balanced on a single choice. One decision would shatter the fog. Sekigahara was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a narrow mountain corridor, a place of passage, not conquest, where roads from east and west funneled through low ground trapped between forested hills. On clear days, commanders could read the valley like a map, but this morning, the land itself seemed to resist understanding. Rain from the night before had turned the earth into thick, clinging mud. Boots sank with every step, wheels jammed, horses struggled to keep formation, armor grew heavier by the minute, soaked and cold against the skin. And above it all, the fog hung low, dense, unmoving, suffocating visibility to a few dozen paces at best. Armies deployed blindly. The Western Army, vast in number, stretched across the valley floor, confident in its strength but fractured in command. Units overlapped unintentionally. Signals were missed. Drums beat without synchronization. On the surrounding hills, powerful clans held elevated positions, perfect for decisive strikes, yet their banners remained eerily still. They watched. They waited. Below them stood Ishida Mitsunari's core forces, unaware that their greatest advantage, numbers, was slowly becoming a liability. Too many men, too little control. The Eastern Army formed more cautiously. Tokugawa Ieyasu's commanders anchored their lines with discipline, choosing defensible ground, protecting flanks, leaving space to maneuver. They understood the terrain's cruelty. They adapted to it. Small clashes ignited without warning. A scouting party collided with an enemy unit by accident. Arquebus shots cracked through the fog, echoing far louder than intended. Panic rippled outward as men rushed to respond to threats they could not see. Formations bent, gaps opened. From the hills, observers saw enough to know the truth. This was no longer a clean engagement. It was becoming something far more dangerous, a battlefield ruled by confusion, delay, and hesitation. The longer the fog held, the more likely mistakes would multiply. And in war, mistakes attract predators. Tokugawa waited. He knew that pressure did not always require movement. Sometimes, all it took was letting uncertainty rot an army from within. As drums faltered and signals failed, the valley reached a breaking point. Someone was about to move. The Battle of Sekigahara did not explode into motion. It hesitated. As the fog lingered, Tokugawa Ieyasu studied the hills rising above the valley, especially one position that troubled him most. There, perched in silence, stood the army of Tokugawa Hideyoshi, 17,000 men, fresh, well-positioned, and undecided. Their banners neither advanced nor retreated. They simply watched. Ishida Mitsunari waited desperately for them to descend. They did not. Minutes dragged on. The fog thinned just enough for shapes to emerge, enough for Ieyasu to realize something critical. Hesitation was spreading like a disease, and hesitation could be forced into decision. He made his move. Tokugawa ordered artillery fire not into the enemy ranks below, but toward the silent hillside. The thunder cracked through the valley, echoing unnaturally loud in the mist. It was not an attack, it was a message. Choose. On the hillside, panic rippled through Kobayakawa's camp. Samurai turned to their lord, eyes searching for command, for certainty. Hideyoshi's hands trembled. He had sworn loyalty to Ishida, but promises had been made to Tokugawa as well. Victory would crown one master of Japan. Defeat would erase the other, and everyone who stood with him. Below, Ishida sensed something was wrong. His lines were engaged, stretched thin, trusting support that had not come. Every second of delay felt heavier than the last. He sent frantic signals. No response. Then, in the fog, banners shifted. Kobayakawa Hideyoshi's army began to move, but not downward in support. They turned. What followed was not a charge, it was a collapse of certainty. Allied units were struck from the side. Commands contradicted one another. Samurai, who believed they were protected, suddenly found enemies at their backs. Shouts of confusion drowned out orders. Trust shattered instantly. The fog that had concealed uncertainty now trapped it. Tokugawa's smaller forces surged forward, exploiting gaps opened by betrayal. Units slipped through fractured lines with terrifying precision. The valley twisted inward, no longer wide enough to escape. Sekigahara had crossed the point of no return, and most of the Western army did not yet realize they were already being surrounded. The fog did not lift when the betrayal began. It thickened, churning with smoke, dust, and the echo of drums beaten in panic rather than rhythm. What moments earlier had been a battle line now dissolved into fragments of men fighting without direction, colliding with allies and enemies alike. Tokugawa's commanders moved quickly. They did not waste strength on grand charges. Instead, small, disciplined units slipped forward through the gaps torn open by Kobayakawa's defection. Where the Western army expected friendly resistance, they found pressure from unexpected angles. Where they tried to regroup, they met silence or sudden attack. The numerical advantage vanished in the confusion. Samurai fought shapes in the mist, unsure whether the banners ahead belonged to friends or traitors. Orders were shouted, contradicted, lost. Drums that once guided movement now echoed uselessly, bouncing off the surrounding hills with no clear origin. Men advanced too far. Others pulled back too soon. The valley became a maze with no exit. Mud dragged at armor and feet, slowing retreats and exhausting the wounded. Horses stumbled. Arquebusiers fired blindly, smoke further choking visibility. Panic crept from the edges inward as units realized they were being pressed not head-on, but from the sides. And still, Tokugawa held his reserves. He watched the Western army fold into itself, knowing that pressure alone could break a force already cracking under betrayal. His men advanced steadily, tightening their formations, sealing off routes of escape without overextending. For Ishida Mitsunari, the realization came too late. The hills that should have protected his flanks now spat enemies downward. Messages went unanswered. Allies hesitated, unsure whether loyalty still mattered or whether survival demanded flight. What should have been a crushing advantage became a trap of his own making. The ring was forming, not yet closed but narrowing with every passing moment. As the fog swirled and the valley echoed with confusion, one truth became unavoidable. The Western army was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting not to be swallowed whole. And Tokugawa Ieyasu was waiting for the moment when fear would finish what strategy had begun. By late morning, the fog began to thin, not enough to grant clarity, but enough to reveal the truth. The Western army was trapped. What had once been open ground now felt like a closing fist. Tokugawa's forces pressed inward from multiple directions, their movements deliberate, relentless. This was no wild slaughter, no chaotic rush. It was compression, space stolen meter by meter, escape routes sealed without announcement. For the men inside the ring, panic finally overpowered discipline. Units attempted to break out, only to collide with fresh resistance where none should have existed. Commanders screamed orders that could no longer be obeyed. Runners fell exhausted in the mud before reaching their targets. Flags dipped, rose, then vanished altogether as formations disintegrated under pressure. Ishida Mitsunari watched his army unravel. The betrayal had shattered trust, but encirclement destroyed hope. Samurai, who had sworn oaths only hours earlier, now fought as isolated pockets of men, each group believing itself abandoned. Courage remained, but courage without coordination bled away strength. The fog carried screams. Metal striking metal. Prayers muttered beneath breath. Tokugawa Ieyasu chose this moment to commit fully. Reserves advanced with crushing calm, exploiting every weakness exposed by fear. The valley echoed with synchronized drumbeats once more this time, only from one side. Hills that had once promised safety now loomed like walls. The ground itself resisted retreat, sucking at boots, dragging the fallen underfoot. Then the fog lifted just enough. Enough for the surrounded to see banners on every side. Enough to understand that the battle was already over. Resistance collapsed into desperate last stands, not for victory, but for honor. Some units threw down arms. Others charged blindly, seeking death over surrender. The shape of the Western Army ceased to exist as an army at all. It became fragments, memories, names that would soon be erased from the future Tokugawa intended to build. By noon, Sekigahara was decided. Not by numbers, not by strength, but by patience, betrayal, and the ruthless use of fear. Japan's fate had shifted quietly, irreversibly in a valley still damp with fog. When the noise finally faded, Sekigahara felt unnaturally quiet. The fog thinned and drifted away, revealing a valley transformed. Broken banners lay scattered across the mud. Weapons rested where they had fallen, abandoned by hands too exhausted or too defeated to lift them again. Survivors stood in stunned silence, unsure whether the battle had truly ended or if death simply paused to catch its breath. The Western Army no longer existed. Those who could flee did so, disappearing into forests and mountain paths. Others surrendered, kneeling in the dirt, awaiting judgment. Ishida Mitsunari escaped the field, but not his fate. Within days, he was captured, his rebellion extinguished, not in battle, but in inevitability. Tokugawa Ieyasu walked the field with measured calm. There was no triumph in his expression, no celebration in his movements. Victory was not something to announce, it was something to secure. He rewarded loyalty swiftly and punished betrayal without hesitation, rewriting alliances before grief could harden into resistance. Casualty numbers were staggering. Entire clans were wiped from political memory. Samurai names that once carried honor vanished from records, their stories swallowed by the same fog that had doomed them. Sekigahara became more than a battlefield, it became a warning. Across Japan, the message traveled faster than any army. Resistance was finished. Castles opened their gates. Lords bent the knee. Negotiations replaced sieges, because everyone now understood the truth. Tokugawa Ieyasu did not merely win battles, he ended wars. Yet, beneath the surface of peace, something darker lingered. The victory had been built not only on strength, but on betrayal, fear, and silence. And those lessons would shape the new order just as deeply as the bloodshed itself. Japan was quiet now, but it was a quiet forged in fog and sealed with memory. Sekigahara was not remembered for its beauty, or even for its bloodshed. It was remembered for what it revealed about power. The battle proved that wars are not always decided by the strongest army, but by the clearest mind. Numbers failed, honor fractured, loyalty bent under pressure, and in the end it was patience cold, deliberate, unforgiving that shaped Japan's future. From this fog-filled valley rose the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime that would rule Japan for more than 250 years. An era of peace followed, but it was a peace born from fear of chaos, carefully controlled and tightly enforced. The samurai would still exist, but their swords would sleep more than they sang. Stability replaced ambition, order replaced glory. Yet Sekigahara left behind an uncomfortable truth. Many who won did so by waiting. Many who lost did so by trusting. History crowned Tokugawa Ieyasu a unifier, a statesman, a founder of peace. But beneath that legacy lies a morning where betrayal spoke louder than bravery, where fog concealed choices that rewrote destiny. The battlefield did not favor the righteous or the brave, it favored the adaptable. And that lesson echoes far beyond Japan. Empires rise not only through strength, but through understanding human weakness, through timing, through knowing when to act and when to let others destroy themselves. Sekigahara reminds us that history is not always decided in clear moments of heroism. Sometimes it is decided quietly, when vision outlasts courage, when patience outlives pride, and when the fog finally lifts too late for those trapped inside it. The valley still exists, but the mourning that shaped a nation has never truly ended.